The shot rang out across the high plains of Wyoming Territory, 1878, stilling everything but Emma Blackwood's thundering heart as she watched her husband crumple to the ground outside their small homestead cabin. The baby in her arms, only 4 months old, startled at the sound but did not wake, blissfully unaware that his father would never again cross the threshold of their home. Blythe Vaughn gripped the doorframe of her cabin and watched as the dust settled over her husband's motionless form. 6 months ago, they had left Illinois for the promise of free land and a fresh start under the Homestead Act. Now Thomas lay dead, shot by cattle rustlers who had been stealing from neighboring ranches. He had simply been in the wrong place at the wrong time, catching them in the act as he returned from town. The first day after the burial, Blythe moved through the cabin like a ghost, hardly seeing the rough-hewn furniture Thomas had crafted with such care. Baby James slept peacefully in the cradle beside their bed, the bed she would now sleep in alone. The second day, she forced herself to eat something, knowing she needed strength to care for her son. By the third day, she faced the brutal truth of her situation. A woman alone with an infant in the unforgiving Wyoming wilderness, 30 miles from the nearest town, on the fourth morning, disaster struck. James woke hungry, but when Blythe attempted to nurse him, she found her milk had dried up, grief and poor nutrition having taken their toll. The baby's cries grew increasingly desperate, his tiny face reddening with hunger and frustration. "Hush now, my sweet boy," she whispered, tears streaming down her face as she paced the floor. "Mama will figure something out." But what could she do? The pantry held beans, flour, and coffee, nothing suitable for an infant. The cow they had purchased just before Thomas's death had wandered off during the funeral, likely stolen by the same men who had killed her husband. And town was an impossible journey on foot with a baby. As James's cries grew weaker, Blythe's desperation mounted. She stood at the door, scanning the horizon, praying for salvation when she spotted a cloud of dust in the distance. Rider approaching. She grabbed Thomas's shotgun, cradling James in one arm as she waited. Friend or foe, she couldn't know. Out here, a woman alone was vulnerable prey. The rider slowed as he approached, and Blythe could make out a tall man on a chestnut gelding. He wore a wide-brimmed hat pulled low, a dusty denim jacket, and had a holstered Colt at his hip. "Madam," he called out, keeping a respectful distance. "Name's Reese Forrester. Don't mean to intrude, but I heard about your trouble from some folks heading west. Thought I might check if you needed any assistance." Blythe kept the shotgun steady. "How do I know you're not with the men who killed my husband?" "I understand your caution, madam. I'm just a cowboy passing through. Been working cattle drives up from Texas, heading to Montana for the season." He gestured to a small herd of cattle grazing in the distance. "My outfit's moving north. I rode ahead when I heard about a widow with troubles." James let out another pitiful cry, and Blythe's resolve wavered. The stranger's eyes softened at the sound. "Your little one sounds mighty hungry," he said gently, the fight drained from Blythe's body. "My milk's gone," she admitted, lowering the shotgun slightly. "He hasn't eaten properly in nearly a day." Reese Forrester nodded, thinking quickly. "The Hansons have a dairy farm about 30 miles east of here. I could ride for milk if you'd allow it." "Why would you do that for strangers?" Blythe asked, suspicious despite her desperation. Reese removed his hat, revealing kind blue eyes and hair the color of wheat. "My mother was widowed when I was just 2. A stranger helped her once when I was sick. I'm just passing on the kindness." Something in his straightforward manner and steady gaze convinced Blythe he was sincere. James's cries were growing weaker and she had no other options. "Please," she said simply, "my son needs help." Reese nodded, replacing his hat. "I'll be back as soon as I can, in the meantime." He reached into his saddlebag and pulled out a clean bandana and a canteen. "Soak this in water and let him suck on it. It won't fill his belly, but it might ease his discomfort until I return." Blythe accepted the items with trembling hands. "Thank you." Without another word, Reese turned his horse and galloped east, disappearing into the vast landscape. Inside the cabin, Blythe soaked the bandana in cool water and let James suckle on the damp cloth. It seemed to soothe him momentarily, but she knew it was only a temporary solution. As the hours passed, She found herself praying for the return of a man she'd just met, while simultaneously preparing herself for the possibility that he might never come back. The sun began to dip toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. James had fallen into a fitful sleep, exhausted from crying. Blythe stood by the window, scanning the empty plains, her hope fading with the daylight. Then she saw a cloud of dust approaching from the east. Reese Forrester rode hard, one arm cradling a small wooden box secured to his chest. He dismounted before his horse had fully stopped, his boots kicking up dust as he strode toward the cabin. "Got it," he announced, slightly breathless. Fresh cow's milk from the Hansons, and Mrs. Hanson sent along a rubber nipple for feeding. Blythe could barely speak through her relief. "You came back. Told you I would," he replied, handing her the box. Inside was a glass bottle of milk nestled in straw, along with the promised nipple that could be fitted to it. With shaking hands, Blythe prepared the milk according to Mrs. Hanson's instructions, written on a scrap of paper. Reese stood awkwardly by the door, turning his hat in his hands. "I should be going, madam. My outfit will be wondering where I am. Please stay," Blythe blurted out. "At least until I know he'll take to it." Reese hesitated, then nodded. "I'll see to my horse." When he returned, Blythe had settled into a chair with James eagerly suckling at the makeshift bottle. The relief on her face was palpable. "He's drinking," she whispered, tears spilling down her cheeks. "You saved his life, Mr. Forrester." "Just Reese, please," he said, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair. "And I'm mighty glad to see the little fellow feeling better." As James drank his fill, Blythe studied the man who had ridden 60 miles round trip for a stranger's child. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps 25 to her 22 years. His face was tanned from long days in the sun, with laugh lines around his eyes that spoke of a good nature despite the hardship of a cowboy's life. "You must be hungry yourself," she said, suddenly aware of her duties as a host. "Please sit. I can offer you coffee and beans at least." "That sounds like a feast after a long ride," he replied with a genuine smile. As Blythe prepared a simple meal one-handed, still holding James, Reese told her about his life on the cattle drives, the characters he'd met, and the places he'd seen. His stories painted a vivid picture of life beyond her isolated homestead, momentarily distracting her from her grief. When he finally stood to leave, the moon was high in the night sky. "I left a note for my trail boss explaining the situation. He's a good man, he'll understand," Reese said, "but I should get back by morning." Blythe nodded, suddenly fearful of being alone again. "How can I ever repay you?" "No need for that," he said, settling his hat on his head. "But I'll be passing back this way in a few months, heading south for the winter. Perhaps I could check in on you and the little one then." "We would like that very much," Blythe replied softly. As promised, Reese returned 3 months later. By then, Blythe had found a wet nurse in a neighboring homestead 5 miles away and had begun trading her sewing skills for milk and other necessities. James had grown chubby and strong, showing no ill effects from his early hardship. Reese arrived with supplies: flour, sugar, coffee, and preserved fruits, luxuries Blythe hadn't tasted since Thomas died. "Just passing through," he explained, though they both knew he had detoured significantly from the southern cattle routes to reach her homestead. He stayed for supper, fixing a broken chair and oiling the hinges on the creaking door before he left. This time, his goodbye felt like a promise rather than a parting. Winter came harsh and unforgiving to the Wyoming plains. Blythe and James survived on carefully rationed supplies and the occasional visit from neighbors checking on the young widow. She thought often of Reese, wondering where his travels had taken him and if he remembered them. In early spring, as the first green shoots pushed through the thawing earth, a familiar figure appeared on the horizon. Reese Forrester rode up to her cabin with the first wildflowers of the season tied to his saddle. "For the lady of the house," he said, presenting the slightly wilted bouquet to Blythe, "and for the young master, a wooden horse." He produced a small, beautifully carved toy from his saddlebag. James, now nearly a year old and crawling energetically, squealed with delight at the toy. Blythe felt her heart flutter at Reese's thoughtfulness. This visit stretched to 3 days, during which Reese repaired the roof damaged by winter snow, reinforced the corral, and helped Blythe plant a vegetable garden. In the evenings, they sat before the fire, James sleeping peacefully in his cradle, and talked of dreams and possibilities. "I've been saving," Reese admitted on the third night. "Hoping to buy a small spread of my own someday. A man gets tired of sleeping under the stars after a while." Blythe nodded, understanding the longing for stability. "This land is hard on those alone," she said softly. Reese looked at her then, something unspoken passing between them. "Yes," he agreed. "It surely is." When he left the next morning, the parting was painful for them both. But now there were letters, carried by passing travelers and supply wagons, keeping their connection alive across the miles. Summer brought Reese back again, this time with a proposition. "The outfit I've been riding with is breaking up. Boss is getting too old for the trail. I've got an offer to work a ranch near Cheyenne. Steady work, good pay." "That's wonderful news," Blythe said, trying to ignore the disappointment that Cheyenne was still a considerable distance away. "It's only 40 miles from here," Reese continued, watching her closely. "I could visit more often, if that would be welcome." Blythe's smile was answer enough. As James's first birthday approached, Reese arrived with a surprise: a milk cow, gentle and already producing. "No child of yours will ever go hungry again," he promised, helping her lead the animal to the small barn. That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, James asleep inside, Reese took Blythe's hand. "I know it hasn't been that long since Thomas passed," he said carefully. "And I would never presume to take his place in your heart or James's life, but I find myself thinking of you both constantly when we're apart." Blythe squeezed his hand. "Thomas would want James to have a father," she said softly, "and me to have a companion. We've been alone too long." Their courtship proceeded with respectful restraint. Reese visited whenever he could get away from the ranch, always bringing small gifts and spending hours playing with James, who had taken to calling him Ree in his limited vocabulary. By Christmas, Reese had saved enough to put a down payment on a small parcel of land just 10 miles from Blythe's homestead. It wasn't much, 80 acres with a dilapidated cabin, but it was his. "I'd like you to see it," he told Blythe one crisp December afternoon. "Both of you." Bundling James in warm blankets, they rode in Reese's newly acquired wagon to his property. The cabin needed work, but Blythe could see the potential as well as the love and hope Reese had invested in it. Standing in what would someday be the main room, Reese took both her hands in his. "Blythe Vaughn, I'm not a man of fancy words or grand gestures, but I love you and James more than I thought possible. Would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Tears filled Blythe's eyes as she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "We would be honored to be your family." They were married in the spring of 1880, a simple ceremony at the local church with James toddling down the aisle ahead of his mother. The community that had supported the young widow now celebrated her new beginning. The newlyweds decided to make their home on Blythe's established homestead, using the lumber from Reese's cabin to expand their home. Together they worked the land, raised cattle, and watched James grow strong and curious about the world. 2 years after their wedding, Blythe gave birth to a daughter they named Hope. As she nursed the infant, Blythe often thought back to that desperate day when her milk had failed and a stranger had ridden 30 miles to save her son. "What are you smiling about?" Reese asked one evening, finding her rocking Hope while gazing out the window. "I was thinking about how you came into our lives," she replied. "How close we came to never meeting." Reese knelt beside her chair, one hand gently stroking his daughter's soft hair, the other finding Blythe's. "I believe some things are meant to be, no matter how unlikely they seem." "A cowboy, a widow, and a hungry baby," Blythe mused. Who would have thought, as their family grew, adding another son 2 years after Hope, Reese and Blythe's homestead prospered. They built a reputation for fine cattle and hospitality, their home often serving as a way station for travelers crossing the still wild Wyoming territory. James grew into a thoughtful young man who called Reese Pa without reservation, though he knew the story of his birth father's sacrifice. Hope inherited her mother's gentle strength and her father's love of open spaces. Young Thomas, named for the man who had first brought Blythe west, showed an early talent for working with animals. 10 years into their marriage, as they sat on their expanded porch watching their children chase fireflies in the dusk, Reese put his arm around Blythe's shoulders. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Marrying a simple cowhand instead of returning east to your family?" Blythe leaned into his embrace. "Never, not for a single moment. Even with all the hardships, the drought years, the harsh winters, the time the river flooded and we nearly lost everything, especially then," she said firmly, "because we faced it together." Reese nodded, pressing a kiss to her temple. Together. As their children grew, so did the territory around them. Wyoming became a state in 1890, bringing more settlers, more towns, and slowly more conveniences. The railroad pushed ever closer to their land, promising easier access to markets and supplies. Yet some things remained unchanged: the vast sky overhead, the rhythm of seasons governing their lives, and the deep bond between a woman who had faced the worst life could offer and survived, and the man who had ridden into her life when she needed him most. On the 20th anniversary of the day they first met, Reese surprised Blythe with a locket containing tiny portraits of their 3 children. "I had them done last time I took the cattle to Cheyenne," he explained as she admired the delicate gold piece. "The artist said I talked about you so much he felt like he knew you already," Blythe laughed, touching the precious gift. "And what did you tell this artist about your wife?" "That she's the strongest woman I've ever known," Reese said seriously. "That she held on when most would have given up. That she raised a fine son alone until a lucky cowboy happened along." "Not luck," Blythe corrected, leaning in to kiss him. "Providence." That night, after the children had gone to bed, James, now a young man of 22 helping run the ranch, Hope a bright-eyed 18-year-old with dreams of teaching, and Thomas a sturdy 16-year-old with his father's gift for horsemanship, Blythe and Reese sat before the fire in the home they had built together. "Do you remember what you said when you returned with the milk for James?" Blythe asked, her head resting on his shoulder. "Can't say that I do," Reese admitted. "I was just relieved to make it back before dark." "You didn't say much at all, actually," Blythe recalled, "but you were smiling." "I remember thinking it was the kindest smile I'd ever seen," Reese chuckled. "Probably just happy to see that little fellow of yours still kicking." "No," Blythe said thoughtfully. "I think even then some part of you knew you'd found your way home." Reese considered this, then nodded slowly. "Maybe so. I never did feel much pull to keep drifting after I met you too." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching, unusual for the late hour. Reese rose, reaching for the rifle kept near the door more from habit than necessity in these more settled times. A rider dismounted in the yard, calling out, "Hello, the house, beg pardon for the late hour." Reese stepped onto the porch, Blythe close behind. "State your business, friend," he called. The rider approached, a young man perhaps James's age. "Name's Daniel Cooper. I'm looking for the Forrester place. I was told you might put up a traveler for the night, got caught by darkness sooner than I expected." "You found us," Reese confirmed, lowering his rifle. "We've got a spare bunk in the barn if you don't mind sharing with the hay." "Much obliged, sir," the young man said, relief evident in his voice. As Blythe prepared a plate of leftover stew for their unexpected guest, she listened to the men's conversation on the porch. "Where you headed, Mr. Cooper?" Reese was asking. "Montana, sir." "Got family there starting a sheep operation. Figured I'd try my luck with them rather than stay in Kansas." "Long journey alone," Reese observed. "Yes, sir. Had a companion when I started, but he took ill in Denver and turned back." Blythe stepped onto the porch with the food. "You're welcome to rest here a day or two before continuing," she offered, handing him the plate. The young man thanked her profusely, his hunger evident in how quickly he consumed the simple meal. As he ate, Blythe and Reese exchanged a glance, a silent communication born of decades together. They both recognized something of themselves in this young traveler: the restlessness of youth, the courage to venture into the unknown, the willingness to trust strangers. "Our son James is riding to Laramie next week with a string of horses," Reese said casually. "If you're not in a hurry, you could travel together at least that far, safer with 2. Daniel looked up, surprised at the kindness. "That's mighty generous, Mr. Forrester." Later, after showing their guest to the barn, Reese returned to find Blythe still sitting before the dying fire. "Thinking about taking in another stray?" he teased gently, settling beside her. "Just remembering when you were the stranger at our door," she replied. "How differently things might have turned out if I'd turned you away." Reese took her hand, his thumb tracing the lines that years of ranch work had etched into her skin. "You're too kind-hearted to have done that, even back then when you had every reason to be suspicious." "Not kind-hearted," Blythe corrected. "Desperate." "A baby's cry can make a mother take all sorts of risks." "Well, I'm grateful for whatever brought us together," Reese said, bringing her hand to his lips. "Though I wish it hadn't been under such painful circumstances for you." Blythe turned to face him fully. "Every happiness has its cost, Reese. What matters is that when I needed someone most, you appeared, and you've been appearing exactly when I need you ever since." The next morning, they introduced Daniel to James, who readily agreed to the company on his journey. Over breakfast, their guest listened in wonder as Hope recounted the story of how her parents met. "So you just rode 30 miles for milk for a stranger's baby?" Daniel asked Reese incredulously. Reese shrugged, embarrassed by the attention. "Wasn't such a big thing. Anyone would have done the same." "No," Blythe said firmly, "not anyone. That's why I married him." The family laughed, and Daniel looked around the warm kitchen with obvious appreciation for the love that filled it. As the years continued to pass, Reese and Blythe welcomed grandchildren, weathered the changing times, and held fast to each other through joys and sorrows. They watched the frontier disappear around them, replaced by fences, telephones, and eventually automobiles. On the 40th anniversary of their first meeting, now elderly but still strong in spirit, they sat on the same porch where their life together had begun. James had taken over most of the ranch operations, allowing them time to simply be together. "You ever wonder what became of those rustlers?" Blythe asked suddenly. "The ones who killed Thomas." Reese was silent for a moment. They rarely spoke of Blythe's first husband or the circumstances of his death. "Can't say that I do," he finally admitted, "though I heard years back that the Johnson gang was caught and hanged in Colorado." "Could have been them," Blythe nodded, satisfaction in her expression. "I hope so, not for vengeance, but for justice." "You never sought revenge," Reese observed. "Some would have." "What good would that have done James or me?" she asked pragmatically. "Besides, if I had, you might never have found us here, alone and in need." Reese smiled, the same smile that had given Blythe hope on that desperate day so long ago. "And I might have continued drifting, never knowing what I was missing." As twilight deepened around them, Reese reached for Blythe's hand, their fingers intertwining with the easy familiarity of a love that had endured for decades. "You know," he said softly, "for a man who spent half his life on horseback, I sure am grateful for the one ride that mattered most." Blythe squeezed his hand. "The 30 miles for milk and the journey home," he added, smiling all the way.